just kind of enjoy them. So let's get to it. There's a new thread out on Substack. It's the fourth in the CTI file series. Michael Schellenberger and I last week, along with Alexander Gutentag, we started publishing documents that were provided to Michael by a whistleblower. As is almost always the case with these kinds of stories, you look at first blush, you see some things, and then as you look more deeply, you find sometimes more troubling or odder themes that you missed at first glance. So with the CTI files, there's a lot of stuff in there about censorship, but I think the theme that's emerging with these documents is that there's an awful lot in there about what you might call offensive operations, and we have to start thinking about the realistic possibility or probability that there isn't just material being removed from the internet, but that there's other stuff going on in the information landscape, ranging from the relatively small, like getting sock puppets and doing trolling operations, like I outlined in the one of those threads last week, to things that are more serious. Now, if you look at, there's been kind of a trend, and I wanted to start with these stories first because there's been kind of a trend in American media in the last 2 or 3 years, but particularly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, after Russia invaded, there was suddenly this spate of news stories in which U.S. officials were quoted talking about their sort of open embrace of information warfare. And what did that mean exactly? Now, one of the key stories that came out about this was this New York Times piece called "Fact and Myth-Making Blend in Ukraine's Information War." Experts say stories like the Ghost of Kiev and Snake Island, both of questionable veracity, are propaganda or morale boosters, or perhaps both. And they go on to talk about the inspirational story. These are sort of the amazing war stories from Ukraine. Doesn't matter what you think about what happened in the war, but you remember there was a lot of hype around a supposed fighter ace nicknamed the Ghost of Kiev. He had this very cool picture that was splashed all over Twitter. And here the Times talks about how popular it was on YouTube. Videos promoting the Ukrainian fighter collected 6.5 million views, while TikTok videos with the hashtag Ghost of Kiev reached 200 million views. Amazing. There was only one problem. The Ghost of Kiev may be a myth. So then they proceed in the story, and it's an amazing story when you read it. And unfortunately, it's not the only exemplar of the genre. There's quite a few of these stories. They go on to talk about how, it's a great story. It's a shame it isn't true. Why can't we have both? Why can't we just do this? And they actually quote, there was a fact-checking site, Snopes, which published an article debunking a video about the Ghost of Kiev. And the New York Times goes into the comments section and quotes a Twitter user commenting on the Snopes article, saying, "Why can't we just let people believe some things? If the Russians believe it, it brings fear. If Ukrainians believe it, it gives them hope. So this is a good thing. Why can't we have that?" Then they go further. Of course, they start doing the comparison. Well, Russia does all kinds of information operations, and what Ukraine is doing, of course, does not compare to the falsehoods being spread by Russia, which laid the groundwork for a false flag operation in the lead up to the investigation, blah, blah, blah. This compared Ukrainian aggression to liberating citizens from neo-Nazis, and that, of course, is completely false. Instead, Ukraine's online propaganda is largely focused on heroes and martyrs, blah, blah, blah. And then I just wanted to show this quote from Alex Stamos, who's an important character in the domestic landscape here in America. He's a key figure in the middle of the Election Integrity Partnership at Stanford Internet Observatory. He was the head of that program. And here's the quote that the Times gets from Stamos. In exercising discretion over how unverified or false content is moderated, social media companies have decided to, quote, pick a side, says Alex Stamos, the director of Stanford Internet Observatory and a former head of security at Facebook. And this is all in the context of saying it's kind of a good thing that while platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter are eliminating all sorts of and disinformation, they're not taking down stories like this. They've decided to pick a side. And the Times is kind of saying this is a good thing. All right, this is not the only one of these stories. As I mentioned, the NBC had a story a little bit later in the conflict, April 6th. Headline, in a break with the past, the U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. You can cover your eyes and guess who wrote this story. If you have any familiarity with media, you knew exactly who wrote it. Yes, it's this person, Ken Delaney. Every single time there's a direct press release that comes from Langley, Ken Delaney wrote it. You can bet basically your house that that's going to be the case. In any case, he goes on, and this is a very similar story to the New York Times story, except this time they're not talking about Ukraine, they're talking about the United States. And it begins with by talking about how Joe Biden made a headline-grabbing assertion. U.S. officials said they had indications suggesting Russia might be preparing to use chemical agents in Ukraine. President Joe Biden later said it publicly, but 3 U.S. officials told NBC News this week there is no evidence Russia has brought any chemical weapons near Ukraine. Then he goes on to say, it's one of a string of examples, he and the other writers, I forget who they are, but let's just say Ken Delaney and others, et al. It's one of a string of examples of the Biden administration's breaking with recent precedent by deploying declassified intelligence as part of an information war against Russia. The administration has done so even when the intelligence wasn't rock solid, officials said, to keep Russian President Vladimir Putin off balance. Then it goes on, and there's essentially the same kind of quote. Multiple U.S. officials acknowledged that the U.S. has used information as a weapon, even when confidence in the accuracy of the information wasn't high. The U.S. is just trying to, quote, get inside Putin's head. And there's all these sort of amazing hagiographic quotes in here. Observers of all stripes called it a bold and so far successful strategy, although not one without risks. And so, all right, here we have in the foreign arena, we have us first talking about how our allies, Ukrainians, are engaging in myth making, and maybe that's okay. Why can't we do that? Why can't we let that happen? Why can't we have those stories? Then they move on to talking about the U.S. doing it. Joe Biden, the president of the United States, goes out and says it. And he says something that's publicly refuted by his own officials immediately right afterwards. And they're describing this as an intentional strategy of releasing information. What's the euphemism? The exact euphemism here. Using information as a weapon, even when confidence in the accuracy of the information wasn't high. So that's just shoving it up your backside right there. I mean, there's no other way to put it. We're lying to you. We're using this as a weapon. We're proud of doing it. We're doing it for the right reasons, which sounds an awful lot like what some of those folks in the CTI file said when we looked through their training examples. Oops, looks like I was sharing the wrong thing. Okay, here it is. Here's the Delanian piece. I'm sorry, I screwed that up. All right. But just to go back through, all right, here it is. Here's Ken Delanian's name, and here's all the stuff. Biden saying it publicly, blah, blah, blah. Accuracy and confidence in the accuracy of the information wasn't high. Trying to get inside Putin's head, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So that brings us to the Hamilton 68 connection, which is the new thread that we're putting out here today. And why the lead up? Why the discussion of those stories involving Ukraine and then Joe Biden and the use of information warfare? Because it's extremely similar to what we saw in the training sessions of the CTI League, which was, again, this independent, quote unquote, volunteer organization that was ostensibly designed to deal with COVID misinformation, disinformation. Now, there's just a very brief point that I want to make with this thread, which is that there are an awful lot of connections involved with the CTI League that are kind of remarkable. And let's just start with the very far background. There is a company called Ushahidi, which is an open source Kenyan OSINT operation / software developer. And if you go back and look, you'll find that the founder of the CTI League, S.J. Terp, and then also Jonathan Morgan, who was the future CEO of New Knowledge and who was involved with creating Hamilton 68, they both joined Ushahidi at the same time in February of 2014, according to their own LinkedIn pages. Now, I contacted Ushahidi. I tried to get them to comment about this, and nobody has so far. But that seems like a pretty remarkable coincidence to me. Now, Morgan's firm would later become famous. We don't need to go through this all, but just to quickly recap, the Jonathan Morgan story is kind of amazing. He goes from being absolutely nobody at all. His company, New Knowledge, is nowhere in the landscape of American culture, American news. And then all of a sudden, sort of randomly, he appears in as a commentator after the Parkland shooting, because he's been quoted in a New York Times piece called "After Florida School Shooting, Russian Bot Army Pounced." So here's that story. All right. And they quote Morgan. The bot's behavior follows a pattern. It says, Mr. Morgan, one of the researchers who worked with the German Marshall Fund to create Hamilton 68, the website that monitors Russian bot and fake Twitter activity. So the theory of this story is that Russians are all over the Parkland shooting. They're amping up both gun control now and hashtag Parkland shooting, both sides of the equation to sow division. The bots focus on anything that is divisive for Americans almost systematically. And Morgan becomes like this for a moment, like 10 seconds. He's actually a person who's on the news. And here he is. I'll just quickly show him being interviewed by Chuck Todd.
We now find out whatever these companies have done doesn't work. What's happening here?
Well, I think what you're seeing is kind of a pattern. The social media companies, I think, are operating very large platforms. It's very complicated to implement solutions at anything of that size. And so what we've seen when ISIS was manipulating social media to amplify their message as terrorists, when Russia was using social media to manipulate the public conversation in the 2016 elections, and now when anybody with an axe to grind about anything decides that they can also manipulate social media to further their agenda, the social media companies come back at that and say, okay, let's focus on a really narrow solution. So let's make sure that ISIS can't post on our platform, or let's make sure that Russia can't post political advertising or can't pay for political advertising on our platform. And those things are really good at, kind of solving a narrow problem and coming up with an immediate solution to whatever the current crisis is, but it doesn't solve the systemic problem. It doesn't solve the kind of inherent design problems on these platforms that allow for this type of exploitation to take place.
We now find...
All right. So here's this guy. By the way, did you notice the bird flying by his head. I love that when that happens in these in live shots. So here's Jonathan Morgan, who is described in later on in a VentureBeat story. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. Here's this person who has no public history as a commentator on anything. His company, New Knowledge, comes out of nowhere. It's never been mentioned. It's not in the news anywhere. And suddenly they're being cited as the only source on a story claiming that Russians are hyping the Parkland shooting. Additionally, there was a spate of stories that began to be hyped around this time. There were also stories about things like the hashtag release the memo affair, in which Devin Nunes was accused of being artificially boosted by Russian intelligence, and that was echoed by people like Senator Richard Blumenthal and Dianne Feinstein. All of this was based on one source, and it was this Hamilton 68 dashboard created by this guy in a beard, who's never appeared anywhere before. He's a cipher. He's barely even a real person. He shows up out of nowhere as an authority on whatever, and starts talking to Chuck Todd about this problem. And if you pay close attention to the argument he made there, the argument is, yes, the platforms like Twitter, they've done some things, they've cleaned up their ads, but they haven't solved the systemic problem. I want to find that bird again. Hang on a second.
The social media companies come back at that and say,
there it is.
Okay, look.
So he said they haven't solved the systemic problem. They basically, essentially, they need us to come in there. They need more guidance to help them rid themselves of their more systemic problem. So time passes, more of these Hamilton 68 stories come out. There's, as I've talked about before, a gazillion of them were done, but there's just not a whole lot about this character, Jonathan Morgan, and who or what he does. Then there's a story in VentureBeat in August of that year that talks about how the company got an $11 million wad of seed capital. And then at the bottom, there's this very interesting little passage. What further distinguishes New Knowledge is that its founders are AI and homeland security experts who grew up in the NSA and have worked as security advisors. Morgan, for instance, was an advisor for the U.S. State Department and published research at the Brookings Institution. So that happens. Then, lo and behold, sort of the next newsworthy thing with Jonathan Morgan is that he's the lead author on this report to the U.S. Senate talking about how Russians were behind basically everything. The report's called The Tactics and Tropes of the Internet Research Agency, detailing a propaganda war against U.S. citizens, a sweeping effort to sow division and support Trump. Not only did it target African American voters, but it also targeted Robert Mueller, so on and so on. I won't play this video, but I recommend that people go in there and check it out. This is sort of an example of the extreme excess that that media figures brought to this story. Here you have Mika and Joe, and then Willie Geist, and then Mike Barnacle, and they're all weeping and wailing about this terrible threat of sort of Russian bots, and how this is proof that Donald Trump is so completely in bed, so to speak, as Joe Scarborough puts it. That they'll work hand in glove. This is actually Barnacle's quote here: "Hand in glove with what Vladimir Putin has set out to do." And all of this, again, is down to experts. And the lead expert, again, is this Jonathan Morgan. Now, like days after this story comes out, after the Senate report, there is a story where the New York Times, in a sort of rare moment of It's institutional honesty, although they could have done the story much earlier because their reporters had knowledge of the situation. They come out and they announce that new knowledge is behind this cockamamie, like lunatic scheme to create fake Russian media profiles and have them follow Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore, and then contact people in the media. And this is something that we saw in the Twitter files. We saw letters from papers like the Washington Post to Twitter, sort of saying, "What's up with these Russian accounts and Roy Moore, and what's going on?" Behind the scenes, Twitter was saying this stuff is all crazy, but it didn't come out. This thing wasn't outed until the end of December 2020, I believe it was, or 2019 or 2018. I'm sorry. And so days after, Morgan is the lead source for just this avalanche of stories about Russian influence. It gets exposed as a fake. And then there's this story in the New York Times that's sort of remarkably like those other stories I just described about the Ukrainian fakery, where here's the headline: "Fake news as moral imperative. Democrats' Alabama move hints at ugly 2020." And this is written by Jim Rutenberg. Jim Rutenberg is the author of sort of famous story called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism," saying that Trump was such a threat that journalists had to abandon traditional standards of objectivity and be focused on being true to history's judgment rather than fairness. So he writes the story, and the lead to his story about the fact that this group connected to the Democratic Party was faking Russian social media accounts. The lead is the Russian media was having way too much fun last week. And then it goes and talks about how all the official outlets like Sputnik and RT are gleefully laughing at the revelations that new knowledge is behind this thing. And why not, right? But here's the paragraph. Russian news outlet Sputnik jumped in the news saying that the Alabama operation seems to cast Democrats' Russiagate accusations into further doubt. The only Russian bots to meddle in U.S. elections, RT said, belong to Democrat-linked experts. And then, amazingly, as a counter to these quotes, the Rutenberg in the New York Times quote Brett Schaefer, an analyst for the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is the group that created Hamilton 68, which is later revealed as a fake, but that's Morgan's partner. They're involved in this thing. They're part of the story. And they quote Brett Schaefer talking about what a shame it was that this came out. It's absolutely awful for democracy, because, basically it's going to undermine American, confidence in American messaging. And so that happens. And then we go on, and of course, I just wanted to recap what we found in the Twitter files. This is Matt Orfalia's little teaser to what we discovered in the Twitter files about Hamilton 68, which was this dashboard that purported to show you that the Russians were following all these things.
You and your team, you guys created a website, Hamilton 68.
Yes, my colleagues and I, we tracked Russian accounts.
That's some bullshit.
So they're literally...
All right, so that guy right there is Clint Watts. He's a former FBI, he's an FBI agent. He's still, I believe, an MSNBC contributor. He was a paid MSNBC contributor at the time. And he was the author. He was sort of the front man for the Hamilton 68 operation, which, again, they claimed that they were tracking 600 plus accounts that were Russian influence accounts or connected to Russian influence. Then it turns out in the Twitter files that they're not that at all. It's 600 ordinary accounts. That was one of the things we got in Twitter files, was the actual the list that was made by Hamilton 68. It's full of all these people like the editor of Consortium magazine, Joe Loria, and Dennis Michael Lynch, a conservative media figure, and then the septuagenarian Trump supporters in Florida, and all kinds of other folks. It's a total lie. It's a fake story. It's an information operation. So we put that out. In the context of putting that out, we sort of were looking at the backgrounds of all the people involved with Hamilton 68, and one of the things we found that was so completely bizarre was that Clint Watts, in addition to being an MSNBC contributor and the sort of public face of Hamilton 68 for the Alliance for Securing Democracy, had authored a graphic novel, actually a graphic novel series called the Resilience series that existed on YouTube. It had about, if you go looking now, you can still find it. It's got about 8 views. They're probably all mine, but they're there. The U.S. government actually paid for this. Now, I'm basically doing a live stream just as an excuse to show this clip. This is what Clint Watts produced.
My father works at the local communications company and was ambushed at a tower he was called out to fix. His attackers were incited to violence by disinformation. They wrongly believed there's a link between 5G and COVID-19. Disinformation has caused too much pain. So, I'm taking the problem head on.
This is the chairman. We don't have much time.
I'm sorry. The punchline to this with the chairman, I got to watch that again.
My father was.
It's one of the weirdest things you'll ever see anywhere, and this is the Department of Homeland Security made this. So here's this young woman whose father, who looks strikingly like Clint Watts, is ambushed by terrorists driven to actual insanity by disinformation. They're crowbar wielding lunatics because they think that 5G is causing COVID, and they've gone and attacked her father, and she's so mad that she's decided to fight back. And what does she do? She connects with the chairman. And folks, you tell me what species we're looking at in this picture or what this is. I have no idea. But let's watch it again.
We don't have much time.
Head on.
This is the chairman. We don't have much time.
All right. Anybody got any guesses as to what animal that is? It's sort of like a metallic wolf, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be a symbol for some sort of secret cutout that she can contact to start fighting the disinformation / misinformation. You know what, Dave Kyle? It might be a fox. I think it is a metal fox. That's a good point. I thought wolf, but fox could be right. So it's sort of this call to, get on board, for this secret counteroffensive against disinformation with this metallic commander chairman. And that's kind of like basically what the CTI League is. And what a coincidence that when we get into the CTI League, we find that all of these characters are all over these documents. First of all, Clint Watts is all over the CTI files. Now, he's not exactly listed as an advisor to it. His name pops up in the predecessor organization, MisinfoSec, quite a bit, but you find links for the new members. You find links to the original hard copy version of his Resilience series. Here's the graphic novel before they made it into a spiffy video to put out on YouTube for nobody to watch. Then you can see there's a thing called the 5 generations of online manipulation, evolution of advanced persistent manipulation. This is the Clint Watts matrix, the 5 Ds, dominate the system, own the system, distort the system, exploit the system, disrupt. And then I don't think this is actually Watts speaking here. I think this is some other anti-disinformationist putting their own spin on it. But they're sort of ostensibly they're taxonomically describing what disinformation is due, and they have all these tactics like dismiss critics, shit list, add target accounts to insultingly named lists, hit and run, attack and delete, ad hominem, make personal attacks, insults, and accusations, string along, continuously respond to anyone who engages to waste their time. That's been a tactic very successfully employed with me on Twitter for like forever, but I'm not going to do it anymore, I promise. So that's on there. And Justice Clint Watts is on there quite a bit. The same concerns about 5G and COVID. This is like their hobby horse in the CTI files documents. They're obsessed with this issue. They seem to think that everybody in the world is about to have their minds absorbed, sort of invasion of the body snatcher style by this CTI League conspiracy. If you look in the documents, these incident reports, you see sort of stop 5G hashtags, and then there's counters. We can ask GoFundMe to investigate, it says. We can ask Facebook to go after the original, blah, blah, blah. But in addition to that, there are also explicit instructions in things like the CTI League Big Book of Disinformation Response. There are instructions to do things like, quote, sniff Hamilton 68 dashboard for themes. Now remember, this is supposed to be a COVID group. Why they would be monitoring Russian bots to look for COVID misinformation or disinformation, it's a little bit odd. Also, chronologically, CTIL came after Jonathan Morgan and New Knowledge were exposed in the Project Alabama scheme. So they clearly, not like they didn't know, but they knew. Also, the predecessor organization to CTIL was a thing called MisinfoSec, which involved in the working group Renee DiResta, who was she's sort of the main personage along with Alex Stamos in the two Stanford projects, the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project. But she was also research director at Jonathan Morgan's New Knowledge when they got busted doing Project Alabama, the insane, ridiculous, idiotic Alabama scheme, and Hamilton 68. She was there. She was the research director at the company when both of those things took place. She's claimed that she didn't have anything to do with it, but you can draw your own conclusions. So there are instructions. This is after New Knowledge has been exposed. They clearly know what's up, but they're still telling these people to sniff the Hamilton 68 dashboard for themes. More examples, for checking data flows. Hamilton 68, they say, is a good example of a place where you might find information. May or may not contain propaganda useful for seeing current themes. And then they have incident reports, which are, and this is more in the AIMIT framework. This is this taxonomic system for identifying disinformation themes and threats. And one thing I found was interesting about this isn't explicitly CTI League, but people in the CTI League had access to these documents. They were looking at some of these incident reports. And when you were looking at Hamilton 68 stories, you would see, for instance, Parkland Teens. They would say presume goals, divide the American public on issues of guns, race, generational politics and activism, method, amplification via sock puppet and cyborg accounts, counters, none/media exposure. Same thing when for another incident report involving Brett Kavanaugh, they this time tag a Quartz piece that quotes Jonathan Morgan. Again, this is, already after Morgan's kind of been unpersoned publicly. He's gone back to being the cipher that he was, but not for the CTI League members. So they read again, what are the presumed goals of the Kavanaugh story? Divide the American public on gender and party lines, promote epistemic confusion, promote both sides relativism. That's one of my favorites. And then again, counters, none. And they quote Morgan here saying that the Kavanaugh hearings have unleashed more U.S. domestic-focused propaganda from foreign-linked networks than his firm has seen in months. Again, the oddness of this is so strange. It's like Jonathan Morgan was nobody, then he was suddenly somebody, then he went back to being nobody again. Just quickly, for the predecessor documents to CTI League, there's a story about Misinfosec, which is kind of the thing that came before CTI. And there's just an interesting quote from Renee DeResta, which I thought was sort of illustrative and may give you some insight into why this is such an exciting field for people in the defense industry. And I shouldn't laugh because this isn't funny, but disinformation is not a problem that can be solved. It's like a chronic disease that can be managed. So disinformation is like the ultimate cash cow for a hospital system. It's like the patient who will never get well, who will need a procedure every day, who will need 1 million procedures a day, and you can bill, endlessly for those services and wait for things to happen. We have to pre-bunk. We have to go on the offensive. We have to sort of red team things instead of just being constantly on the waiting for things to happen and responding. We have to preemptively go out there, proactively disrupt nefarious activity rather than reactively respond to it. And this is in conjunction, it comes in conjunction later with, build your sock puppet accounts. Can we troll their bums if they refuse to take this account down? Get your burner phones, lock your shit up, all this sort of spy talk about doing double identities. That's there. Then I wanted to point this out. The original discussion about this is about the funding. So there was a podcast that had as guest Pablo Brewer, who was he was a defense official for Special Operations Command. He's often described as a technologist there. Also identified with the Donovan Group, which is named after the famous intelligence figure. And he's saying that there are other sectors that are funding this. The original discussion about this was funded by the Donovan Group. So then S.J. Terp down here later says, we did get a little bit of money from Craig Newmark, the Newmark Foundation for Misinfosec Working Group. We need to mention that too. Thank you. Thank you, Craig. So the Newmark Foundation, we got to point that up because the Newmark Foundation turns out to be the primary funder, one of the primary funders of the Election Integrity Partnership. At least that's according to some sources that we've been talking to in the last week or so, according to some of the principals themselves. There was also, and we'll get to this in a moment, there was also some funding to a Harvard program that came from the Newmark Foundation. But the original discussion for this comes from various sectors, including the Donovan Group. So it seems a lot like the original impetus for this idea comes from the Department of Defense or people in the Department of Defense. And if you go and look at what the Donovan Group does and look at companies like SoftWorks, you'll see that they're into some pretty crazy things. And it's not surprising that the resulting product, MisInfoSec products, MisInfoSec and CTIL, are sort of very unabashed about talking about left of boom attacks and psyops and going on offense. And so here we have a program that involves both of the people from, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Just here's a quote that needs to be read. There's another MisInfoSec paper. Watts is again quoted complaining about how the playing field is not level in the anti-disinformation space. And it says, counterattack and its limitations. Democracies face structural disadvantages relative to the producers of misinformation. Clint Watts cites the Kremlin's strategic edge from Russia's cybercrime underworld and the plausible deniability it gives. The U.S. and its allies don't have this advantage. So basically saying that we need to be able to hit back. Like we can't hit back. We can't rely on the cybercrime underworld the way Russia does. But this is the same person who authored your lunatic graphic novel fantasy about getting secretly in touch with the chairman. I think you can read between the lines. I mean, normally in journalism, it's not indicated to do that. But I think you can infer quite a few things from this particular situation. So they're basically complaining that that they're restrained by the law. This is similar to what we heard from Brewer last week in those training videos, where he was talking about how the people who do it overseas are usually the CIA, the NSA, and the DoD, but they don't have the legal authority to do it here. People who have the capability are the Department of Defense, but they can't operate against U.S. citizens. So it's left to the Department of Homeland Security and this new thing, the Global Engagement Center, which just has a measly $250 million. And oh my God, they're not very capable. So we have to help them out. This stuff, this is all real. This is all happening. This is the kind of story that I would think would be so unlikely as to be ridiculous once upon a time, but it actually took place. So in sum, you have the principals from New Knowledge, Jonathan Morgan and Renee DiResta, with connections to this SJ-TERP, along with Clint Watts from the Alliance for Securing Democracy and the FBI. All three of these people have connections to Hamilton 68, Project Alabama, and now they have ties to this volunteer group, if you will, that is propagandizing the idea that we can't just sit still and let disinformation happen, that we need to engage in what they call left of boom preemptive activities. And here I'll just quote from this one passage from another MisInfoSec paper. When looking at left of boom psyops, models map closely to the marketing funnel with the addition of a planning stage, while right of boom glosses over the end consumer specific considerations in a process flow defined by production, distribution, dissemination, yada, yada, yada. PSYOPs literature is packed with useful distinctions. Defensive propaganda is designed to maintain an accepted and operating form of social or other public action, but offensive propaganda is designed to interrupt social action not desired by the propagandist or to predispose targets to social action which he desires. Again, they're ostensibly describing what other people do, right? So this is what the Russians do, is they engage in offensive propaganda designed to interrupt social action not desired. I love that phrase. It's like sort of wonderfully horrible English, but it's very, very characteristic of these folks. So what do you have in some? You have in some this group that involves a lot of figures who were engaged in high-level fake news operations that were not confined to spreading a few rumors on the internet via trolls. These were huge, massive deceptions that spread all the way across the legacy news media and continue to exist despite a few corrections here and there. The public perceptions, there's never been any public apology about these stories, and even the coverage in the moment by the New York Times took the position that, isn't it a shame that this came out? You know, the Russians are having so much fun with this. So, you know, what are we to think? I mean, the more we look at this, at these CTI files, and we spent a lot of time in the Twitter files trying to figure out, well, let me back up there for a moment, just to sort of dismount on this entire topic. When we started the Twitter files, we had this strategy of trying to put out stories as quickly as we could, to basically to stay ahead of the hit pieces, because we knew that there was going to be so much negative propaganda coming out. So we focused on simple, easily demonstrable stories that were in the documents, and that in themselves were newsworthy and confirmable and all of that. But we ignored kind of like larger forest for the trees stories because we just didn't have time to do it. And it wasn't until later that people like Michael and myself and and Andrew Lowenthal and Aaron Mate and Sue Schmidt and all these other folks and Alex Gutentag, we started working on this idea that there was this elaborate censorship by proxy system, and what Michael called the censorship industrial complex. I think that's a very good phrase that I hope sticks in the same way that something like the 99% sticks. But it took us a while to get to that theme and to really understand that was what we were looking at in those documents, was this big system of what Luke Harding of the Guardian called the shared endeavor, where groups that should be acting as checks on each other's influence, like the media, civil society organizations, the military, tech platforms, which should have their own capitalistic self-interest. Instead, they're all partners in this operation to shade content, to control content, and that turned out to be the big theme that we focused on. Well, with these documents, sometimes it takes a while to realize that maybe you're not seeing the entire picture. And with the Twitter files, while we thought we were getting a comprehensive view of something, I think we left out the possibility, or at least I did. I left out the possibility that there might be a more active strategy to disinform, to engage in information warfare. And that's why I wanted to start off with those stories about Ukraine, and Joe Biden talking about the Russians, engaging in chemical warfare possibly, and it being a great thing, that the U.S. is breaking with its tradition to give reporters intel even when it's not rock solid. I mean, that's as close as they can come to just telling you that we're lying. but they're admitting they do this overseas, that they admit that our allies do it, then they admit that we do it. They're bragging about it. How far are we really from admitting that we have to do this domestically to stop people like Donald Trump? I mean, this was kind of the theme of Jim Rutenberg's original influential column. The Trump is impacting, testing the norms of objectivity in journalism. Is that, we can't just focus on what's true and what isn't true and just leave it to readers to sort that out anymore. We have to be more aggressive in that. We have to show them the way. What if the truth isn't enough? What if that turns out to be not persuasive enough? Well, then maybe we need a better story. Why can't we have both? I mean, that's the theme in this amazing Russia story. This quote is just such an amazing quote. Why can't we just let people believe some things that the New York Times put out there? Well, what if that's what's going on with all of these stories? From everything from, Russian bots are attacking Robert Mueller. Russian bots are trying to prevent African Americans from going to the polls. Russian bots want Bernie Sanders to win. There's disinformation behind healthcare, hashtag healthcare for now, or free Gaza, or whatever it is. But then, we also have to look at these big schemes like Hamilton 68 and Project Alabama and think, well, are there more of those? Maybe there's a lot of those. And maybe that's part of what this is, because they come so close in these documents to coming right out and saying that this is what we need to do, to infiltrate. And they always couch it as, sometimes we need to infiltrate these groups so that the truth can come out, so that the better information can come out. But, I think it's abundantly clear at this case that this anti-disinformation complex, which we thought was designed for primarily defensive purposes, to stop people from speaking, to prevent independent media outlets like this one, like, Glenn Greenwald's System Update, like Russell Brand's Stay Free, whatever it is, or Richard Eskow, or any of a dozen other, or the Gray Zone, any of a dozen other news outlets that have been, hampered, had their fundraising cut off. We thought it was just about that. But what if it's that in addition to this? Then we're in this whole other new world of stuff. That we have to countenance as we try to navigate the informational landscape. It puts us in a place that we've never really been before. It was already difficult to kind of figure out where reality was when you couldn't see what was going on, who was being censored, or how much people like Jay Bhattacharya were being censored. But this is even scarier if you add the de-amplification, the censoring, to the introduction of things that are fake. We know that it's happening overseas. How much is it happening at home? We don't know. But it's very, very troubling that these groups, that the Department of Homeland Security would still happily be associated with someone like Clint Watts after the Hamilton 68 thing has been exposed. That tells you a lot about their thinking. And it tells you a lot about the thinking of all these folks in media after this stuff has come out, that there's no correction, that this is they believe in this. And so, again, I just want to thank the whistleblower in this story who came forward. These documents, I think, are going to end up proving significant on multiple fronts. They're giving us a glimpse into this taxonomic framework called AIM-IT, which became something called Disarm. And, as Alexander Gutentag wrote on yesterday, there's an awful lot of offensive stuff that we have to sort through and try to figure out how often this is going on. But I think that's the story here. That is what these documents ultimately are about, or at least that's the big theme for me, is the offensive side of this, and we got to figure out what that means. Just quickly, just a couple of quick notes before I go. A couple of related stories this week. Joan Donovan, the renowned academic from Harvard, who was involved in, she was the head of something called the Shorenstein Center. She filed a whistleblower complaint, and it's too complicated to get into now. But essentially what you need to know is that the Shorenstein Center, which had just a gigantic amount of funding, there was at least $5 million sent to this thing. It was allied with the government, with Craig Newmark, some other funders. She filed a whistleblower complaint that's like 100 and something pages long. It's crazy, and it's very revealing about the thinking of people involved in this world. She's one of the most influential anti-disinformation folks, and she's essentially claiming that Facebook forced her out of her job. Just to quickly read, there's all kinds of stuff in here. There's one passage where she talks about the trauma that she suffered from all of the pressure that was being put on her. It was clear from that the sharp pivot of the subject that not only did she know that this was coming, but that she was already planning to take over one of my impactful programs. It was such a deep betrayal. I hung up the phone and ran to the bathroom vomiting. I screamed and cried into a pillow all afternoon and finally went to sleep after taking medication for panic attacks. And then, she describes being hospitalized for stress and calling, the dean to talk about how horrible and unfair all of this is, that her gazillion-dollar program is being taken away from her, and that she's not able to censor everybody on Earth, and what a massive injustice it is. If you're interested in reading that at sort of Tolstoyan length, I highly recommend reading that complaint. Additionally, there's a story that came out a while ago, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do these live streams, because there are lots of little stories that if I wrote them, it would take way too long, or I don't have the time to do it. But this is kind of an important story. 6 years ago, some of you might remember that there was a moment when there was a leak of a very important story. At the time, it resulted in a story, among other things, in the Washington Post, that Carter Page had been found by the FISA court to be an agent of a foreign power. And this was presented to everybody in the press, not as corruption of the FISA process, but as proof that Donald Trump had in his circle, basically Russian agents. And this story was like the shot heard around the world. It was everywhere. And it rocketed around the universe. I think the original piece might have been written by Ellen Nakashima and some other folks. It's the usual suspect. It's the same 11 reporters dominate the world. Anyway, she's on that piece, I think. And so, but after that, there was a leak investigation that was started. And we only know about this because basically the Justice Department started this investigation. They tried to figure out who might have been the source for all these press stories that came out. Now, at the time, I think the Department of Justice, you had a strong impression that the folks who ran the Department of Justice wanted that story to come out. I mean, the DOJ was leaking like a sieve the entire Trump administration. And suddenly there's an investigation into Congress. First of all, assuming that the leak came from Congress because some of these files and documents had been shown to certain committees. They had been presented in what's called a SCIF, a secure facility in Congress. Well, it turned out that the leak, or at least the person who was prosecuted for the leak, was the sort of head of security for I believe the Senate Intelligence Committee, who had a girlfriend who was a journalist. But in the process of looking for the source who was not that, the Department of Justice subpoenaed the personal information, the emails, the phone records of basically everybody in Congress, including attorneys and attorneys for members of Congress. And the only reason we know about this is because despite the fact that they imposed a gag order, the DOJ imposed a gag order. Here the gag order is for Google. They were looking for sort of Google phone numbers and Gmail. They imposed a gag order for a period of 1 year, then re-upped the gag for 5 years. And at the end of this incredibly long process, Google finally told a whole bunch of people that this had happened. They finally revealed to their customers. Now, there are other companies that just simply don't tell you, even though that would be great customer service. Google does what they probably should do, and informs these people. But the terrifying thing about this is here's this legal investigation where they're willy-nilly looking at every congressional aide, and there are private communications, including things like the Google phones of spouses. Like, they're working backwards without any probable cause that any of these people had anything to do with the case. They just sort of went for every conceivable device that these folks had. And then they looked to see who these people were talking to. This kind of investigation, without anybody knowing anything about it, they could basically map out everybody's sources. The Justice Department could figure out which congressional staffers are talking to which journalists remarkably easily, without ever having to inform anybody, or justify this decision. They didn't give anybody the opportunity to contest, this sort of request for. It was a grand jury request for documents, but this is a really frightening thing. There are some other stories that are important background for this, but this was something that was glossed over in the press when it came out. I think somewhat remarkably, because this is a story that directly affects journalists, in addition to congressional staffers. I mean, who wants to have the government looking, into your private records without even letting you know about it? But it is a huge chilling effect that news like this will have with anybody who talks to anybody on the Hill. If you know that willy-nilly the Justice Department can go and just start an investigation like this, and you won't find out about it for 6 years, or at minimum, if you find out about it at all, you might think twice about calling a certain person to ask a certain question. And more importantly, I think the staffers will think twice about talking to the journalists. And that's pretty disturbing. There's also, there's the angle in this that where this leak investigation didn't look inward. There's no reason to think that this story wasn't leaked by somebody in the Justice Department at the FBI. I mean, they leaked everything else during the Trump years, for God's sake. And you know, every person familiar with the matter that leaked every bullshit story for you know 5 straight years was, you know, had a pass into the Justice Department. And for some reason they were not subjects of this investigation. So what if they what if the leak came from DOJ, and you have this investigation which just performed, you know, it's sort of an intelligence gathering thing in addition to being, you know, a hunt. It's like the OJ's search for the real killers, basically. And look, this is an interesting story. I should have written more about it when it first came out. But eventually it needs to be followed up, and there needs to be some, you know, some clarity about what happened here. Hopefully, maybe an IG investigation, you know, into how this can happen and whether any rules were broken. But wanted to make everybody aware of that, and to, you know, to give them an opportunity to look into that on their own. And I'll post some things on Facebook's on Substack so that you can find links to that. In any case, thank you very much, everybody, for hanging out. I'm going to try to make these things shorter and tighter. I'm new at this. I suck at being on TV, as everybody knows, but I'm trying. I got better equipment. I got my Jeff Spicoli globe back here to try to make things look a little bit more, a little less dingy than they were before. But we're going to do this more often. You know, I'll see you probably in a couple of days. And until then, thanks everybody for subscribing to Substack. If you're a subscriber, if you're not a subscriber, please do. I'm in the position now of having to ask you to do that because everybody's accounts are being stepped on so much that it's not quite so automatic that that you're gonna have your stories go everywhere now. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and talk to you again soon. All right, take care now.